Good afternoon. I'm Fred Leon, Professor of Psychology and Director of the Center for Multicultural Psychology Research. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2009 Annual Distinguished Lecture in Multicultural Psychology. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Harry Triandis. Professor Triandis is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Illinois. He received his PhD from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York in 1958, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Athens, Greece in 1987. He was Chairman and Secretary General of the Society of Experimental Social Psychology, President of the International Association for Cross-Cultural Psychology from 74 to 76, as well as the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, APA's Division 9, and also President of the Inter-American Society of Psychology and the President of the International Association of Applied Psychology, as well as Divisions 8. He was Ford Foundation Faculty Fellow, Fellow of the Center for International Studies at Cornell, Guggenheim Fellow in the Center for Advanced Studies at University of Illinois. He received an award for significant contributions to the development of psychology from the Inter-American Society of Psychology in 1981. He's an honorary fellow of the International Association for Cross-Cultural Psychology and was a distinguished Fulbright professor in India in 1983. He's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and at the University of Illinois, he was designated as a distinguished scholar and received the Centennial Citation from the American Psychological Association for significant contributions to the establishment of cross-cultural psychology as a distinct discipline. And he was also the American Psychological Association's Distinguished Senior Lecturer in 1994. Professor Triandis also received the Kleinberg Award from the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, the APA's Distinguished Contributions to International Psychology Advancement, the APS James Cattell Award, and the APA Division 52 named him the Distinguished International Psychologist of the Year in 2002. He received the Lifetime Contributions Award from the Academy of Intercultural Research in Taiwan in May 2004. What is not evident in all these amazing accomplishments is that Harry is also a very kind and generous individual. I have to tell you a story of my career and entry into cross-cultural psychology, and of course everyone who's interested in cross-cultural psychology know of Harry's work. So I contacted him at the University of Illinois, and he graciously agreed to meet with me to share his research on individualism and collectivism, which I then proceeded to do and so forth. So some years later, I found out while I was at a conference at the East-West Center in Hawaii that Harry was also there doing his sabbatical, and I was a little nervous to intrude upon his sabbatical, but contacted him anyway. And to my surprise, he invited me and said, well, I'm going snorkeling in Hanama Bay on Saturday. Would you like to come and we can talk about cross-cultural psychology? So this was my experience of the generosity of Harry Triandis. So today, Harry's going to share with us his presentation, Cultural Syndromes and the Effects on Some Psychological Variables. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Harry Triandis.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for the nice introduction, Fred. And also for remembering Hanuma Bay. I wouldn't miss doing snorkeling in Hanuma Bay. This is one of the great experiences. I'm going to talk to you about cultural syndromes, but let me start with a sort of a simplified version of how things are related to each other. I'm thinking of the environment shaping culture, and then culture shapes people, personality, whatever you want to call it, and then that together with the situation shapes behavior. So this is sort of a simplified version of the theory, if you like, of how these things are related to each other. And the environment, of course, varies in a very large number of ways. You can think of the climate, you can think of the way people make a living, et cetera, et cetera. And there are hypotheses about the kind of environment that generates different kinds of cultures. For example, there is a hypothesis that was proposed by Joseph Campbell, who has been interested in myths and religions. He hypothesized that if the horizon is very big, and as it occurs in deserts, then you have monotheism. And if the horizon is cut up the way it is in jungles, like in India. You have polytheism. Now, this is an interesting hypothesis that I think needs to be examined in more detail. But you can see here the idea that the nature of the environment shapes the culture, because, of course, religion is an important aspect of culture. And then the culture shapes the people, and then the people with the situation behave in different ways. Now, a cultural syndrome is one of the ways in which we can analyze cultures. We can talk about a variety of cultural syndromes, and today I will talk about 4 of them. Simple versus complex cultures, I will define these in a minute. Tight versus loose cultures, collectivist versus individualist cultures, and horizontal versus vertical cultures. But there are many more ways in which one can talk about cultural differences. It's just that you have to talk about a few things if you have an hour, and I selected those 4 things. Now, a cultural syndrome is a pattern of beliefs, attitudes, norms, role definitions, values, etc., that is organized around a theme. So the theme for simple cultures is that things are relatively simple. There are few roles, for example. Whereas in complex cultures, you have complexity. You have many roles and so forth. In tight cultures, you have the importance of norms. And so norms are terribly important, and they are imposed tightly. So if you don't do what you're supposed to do, you get into serious trouble. In loose cultures, on the other hand, norms are imposed loosely. So if you don't do what you're supposed to do, people don't get too excited. In collectivist cultures, you have the importance of the collective, of the group as the center for organizing all the information of a cultural syndrome. And in individualist cultures, you have the importance of the individual. Everything is organized around the individual. And in horizontal cultures, you have the emphasis on equality, versus in vertical cultures, you have the emphasis on hierarchy. Now, let me give you some examples of such cultures. Hunters and gatherers are relatively simple, and information societies are relatively complex. And if you think about the number of roles that exist in a hunter and gathering culture, there might be 20 roles. Whereas in the information societies, you have 250,000 jobs, for example. That's a tremendous complexity. So you need specialists to guide people through their careers in a complex culture. The Taliban is a good example of a tight culture. They had all kinds of rules about what you can and cannot do. And it was mostly what you cannot do. They emphasized, for example, that you cannot fly kites. You cannot listen to music. You cannot watch television, etc., etc. Now, if you did these things, you were a bad person, and they might even execute you. Now, you may say, well, this is a very strange thing, but actually in our own culture, we started being very tight. In 1607, when our ancestors arrived in Virginia, they required that people attend a Church of England service 14 times a week. And if they didn't do that, they were really punished. Sometimes they were killed. So you can see here a very tight culture. Now, on the other hand, over time, our culture has become looser and looser and looser. Now, it's not quite as loose as Thailand. Rural Thailand is quite loose. If you have an appointment and you don't show up, people smile. So they're very tolerant. It's the smilest culture that I have ever met. Now, we have changed, and we have become much looser over time. I remember 60 years ago, this culture was pretty tight, relatively speaking. Look at the movies that they used to make 60 years ago and the ones they are making now. There's quite a difference in the tightness that is involved. Now, the next dimension, East Asia as an example of a collectivist culture, and Western culture as an example of the individualist cultures. Now, this is, unfortunately, the data have been collected from these two types of cultures. But we suspect that the rest of the world also has varieties of individualism and collectivism. It's just that we don't have the data on it. Finally, the horizontal vertical is exemplified by Sweden on the one hand and Germany, where in Sweden you're not supposed to stick out. You're not supposed to be the best. You're not supposed to be famous. Whereas in Germany, you are supposed to be famous and so forth. I'll give you some more examples later. Now, let me say that this tight-loose dimension is one which is really quite significant. And one of the reasons it is significant is that in my observation and research on the subject, Islam is much tighter than the West. In fact, the contrast between Islam and the West occurs primarily on this dimension. And I have a hypothesis, not the data, but a hypothesis, which goes something like that. Suppose that you have a very, very tight culture, which is also patriarchal, and you have the need to object to the father, which is sort of the Oedipus complex kind of idea. Now, you know that it depends on who has authority. If the father has authority, then you object to the father. If the mother's brother has authority, as it does in the Triandis, then you object to the mother's brother. But anyway, whoever is in authority. So in patriarchal cultures, in which you have tightness, how do you rebel? You cannot rebel by becoming looser, because then you become not a very good Muslim. But you can rebel by being tighter and become really extreme. And so I think that terrorism, among other things, is predisposed by having a tight culture with patriarchal structure in which people try to rebel, and some of the children who oppose their fathers become terrorists. It's a hypothesis that I think is worth examining. Now, let me go on and talk about varieties of these cultures. You can mix them up, so you can have vertical collectivists and horizontal collectivists and vertical individualists and horizontal individualists and so on. And all of this occurs at the level of culture. But within culture, you have another set of phenomena, and it's easier to use another terminology. So I use the terminology of idiocentrics that corresponds to individualists and allocentrics that corresponds to collectivism. Now, the idiocentrics and allocentrics exist in every culture, as far as I can tell, just in different mixtures. So in collectivist cultures, you're going to have more allocentrics. In individualist cultures, you're going to have more idiocentrics. But you're going to get both kinds of types, both personality types, in every culture. Now, it's the fit between culture and personality that's critical. If you have an allocentric and a collectivist culture, that's fine. It's a good adjustment. If you have an idiocentric and individualist culture, fine. That fits well. But if you have the other two types, an idiocentric in a collectivist culture or an allocentric in an individualist culture, then you have problems. The allocentric in an individualist culture finds that he does not have enough relationships. So he will join communes, he will join unions, associations, etc., etc. The allocentric in a individualist, the allocentric in an individualist culture will feel that the culture is pushing him too much in directions that the group once pushed. And there is a kind of relationship between the dimensions that I presented first. In other words, there is correlation between simple, tight, and collectivists. The correlations are not very high. They're of the order of 0.4. But nevertheless, they do exist. And so what you have in the situation of the idiocentric is, if the idiocentric is in a collectivist culture, he feels not quite in a very pleasant environment. The allocentric in an individualist culture, again, doesn't feel in a very good environment. So it's the fit between culture and personality that's crucial. Now, what are some of the attributes of allocentrics and idiocentrics? First of all, there's a difference in self-definition. If you ask people, who are you? Tell me who you are. The allocentrics will give a lot of social responses. The idiocentrics do not give very many social responses. In fact, Illinois undergraduates, the mode of Illinois undergraduates is 0 social responses. Now you go to China, on the other hand, you get about 50%, the mode is 50% of social responses. They will say things that have to do with the group in some way. I'm a member of such and such. I am an uncle, which is, of course, referring to the family, and so forth. So the self-definition is different. Goal priorities are different. In collectivist cultures, there is a kind of consistency between the goals of the individual and the goals of the group. In individualist cultures, on the other hand, the individual goals may not be at all consistent with the goals of the group. And when there is this kind of inconsistency, it's perfectly okay for the individual to say, I will do what I would like, rather than say, I have to do what the group wants me to do. So you do have a kind of situation where the goal structure is quite different. Then when it comes to social behavior, in the case of collectivists, both norms and attitudes are important. If you think of better weights determining social behavior, they are about equal in importance. People do what's fun, but also what they should do. Whereas in individualist cultures, they do mostly what's fun. And what they should do, well, yes, they do it, but not really quite as much. Finally, there's a tendency, if you don't like your group, there is a tendency for individualists to leave the group. And there's a tendency for collectivists to stay in the group. There's one study that was done by Arzu Wasti in Turkey. She had Turks who didn't like their job. And she gave them tests to examine whether they were idiocentric or allocentric. Now, if they didn't like the job and they were allocentric, they said that they will stay in the job. If they were idiocentric, they said they're going to look around to see if they can find another job. So you can see here a tendency to be much more willing to move in the case of the idiocentrics. Now, there is a kind of a simplification when we use the nation as the unit of analysis. It's most convenient, of course. We collect data here, and then we collect data there, and we sort of use the nation as the unit of analysis. However, this is really an oversimplification, because there are many demographic factors that change the probability that a person will be idiocentric or allocentric. And so we have to take these demographic factors very seriously. Here are some of the factors that are quite critical. Cultural heterogeneity increases the probability that people will be idiocentric. Social class has an effect, which is quite important. The lower social classes in most cultures are allocentric, and the upper social classes are idiocentric. Exposure to other cultures tends to make people idiocentric. Education makes people idiocentric. Population density, on the other hand, makes people allocentric. Because if you have a large density, you have to pay attention to what other people are doing. Suppose you are putting rice seeds on a field. If you don't know what the other people are doing, you might actually do the same thing that they're doing, and that will waste one of the seeds. So you have to really pay attention to what other people are doing. So the greater the density, the more you pay attention to what other people are doing. Social mobility tends to make people more idiocentric, as does residential mobility. The kinds of people who move from one job to another and from one city to another and so forth, residential mobility, are more idiocentric than the kinds of people who stay in one place. Salient common fate increases the probability that somebody will be allocentric. Religion increases the probability that the person will be allocentric. The religious people tend to be more allocentric than individualists. Socialization has a tendency to make people either allocentric or idiocentric. When you have a bilateral family structure where both the mother and the father are important and they influence the socialization of the children, then you're going to have more idiocentrics. But if you have a patriarchal structure or a matriarchal structure, although there are no data for matriarchal, but probably if we did the research we would find it. For patriarchal, in any case, if you have only one input, then that tends towards allocentrism. The size of the family has something to do, because in large families you have to have rules, otherwise things will become chaotic. So you have more allocentrism in large families. Strict upbringing increases allocentrism. Age increases allocentrism. There are studies in which they measured the degree of individualism, collectivism, or allocentrism, idiocentrism of high school students, their parents, and their grandparents. And the older the samples, the more allocentric they were. Exposure to the mass media has a tendency of making people more idiocentric, because the mass media are emphasizing having fun rather than doing your duty. There are very few sort of soap operas that emphasize doing your duty. So the theory that I use is very simple-minded, that behavior is a function of the situation, the personality, and their interaction. It's their interaction that is most important. There's one study which I think is particularly revealing. What they did is they created in industry, artificially, a collectivist and individualist society. And then they took people who were either allocentric or idiocentric, and they looked at the degree to which they were cooperative. And what they found was allocentrics in a collectivist environment were very cooperative. In the other three cells, they were not so cooperative. So it's the interaction that matters. Now, another thing which matters is whether you've been exposed to primes of various kinds. If you prime people in an idiocentric or in allocentric direction, you get different results. In one study, we asked people to think of their family and whether their family was similar or different from them. And when we gave the similar instruction, this was random assignment. So when we gave the similar instruction and then measured their responses, they tended to be allocentrics. When we gave the different instruction, then they tended to be idiocentric. Now, the problem here with complexity in this area is that there can be quite a bit of difference depending on the domain that you are looking at. If you think of domains such as social relations, politics, religion, economics, aesthetics, education, values, and so on, a person can be idiocentric in one of these domains and allocentric in another domain. So you get a good deal of complexity depending on the domain. If you think of Mao's China, it was collectivist across the board. But then the Chinese started becoming looser in some respects. They sort of allowed their artists to express themselves. So the aesthetic side became individualist. Then they allowed economic activity that was more idiocentric. And so that part became more idiocentric, more individualist, if you like. And so what you have essentially is a change in culture which modifies particular domains but leaves other domains the way they were during the Mao period. Now, what are some of the consequences of collectivism? This is an area where there has been a great deal of research. And so I can give you a summary of some of the things that have been found. There's a tendency in collectivism to think holistically. Everything is related to everything else. And they use context a great deal. They pay a lot of attention to context. I had a friend from India who told me that he was a meat-eating vegetarian. And I said, what is that? And he said, well, I'm a vegetarian, but when other people eat meat, I eat meat. You see the context, the importance of context is terribly important. Now, collectivists also have a tendency to tolerate contradictions. Contradiction is not such a bad thing. We in individualist cultures and in the West have a tendency to emphasize contradictions. And if somebody really is not consistent, there's something wrong with this person. Not so for collectivists. You can be inconsistent, that's okay, because you behave according to the situation. And so if the situation is the important element, then of course you're going to be inconsistent. In one situation you do one thing, in another situation you do something else. Communication is different. In collectivist cultures there's a tendency to pay attention to how something is said. In individualist cultures, on the other hand, you pay attention to what is said. There's the famous example of 1991 in Geneva when Secretary Baker told the Iraqis, if you don't move out of Kuwait, we're going to attack you. And the Iraqis understood that the Americans will not attack. Now that's quite a mistake. Now how did they do that? Why did they make the mistake? They paid attention to how he said it. He was not angry. He was not red in the face. He didn't throw anything at them. He just said, if you don't move out, we're going to attack you. That's all. So they said, he's just talking. Nothing to it. Didn't pay any attention. Now you see how these cross-cultural mistakes occur. The collectivists also have a tendency to apologize a lot. They apologize in situations which really, from the individual's point of view, don't make much sense. There was a case, for example, where some Japanese terrorists attacked the airport in Tel Aviv. Well, the Japanese apologized all over the place. Even the dean and the rector of the university in which the terrorists had gone apologized. My people did this. That's a terrible thing that they did. I must apologize. Now, individuals would not apologize in that kind of a situation. Collectivists also think dialectically. There's thesis and antithesis and synthesis and so on. And behavior is seen as due to external factors in collectivism. In other words, the group or the roles or the culture, etc., influence what you're doing. Whereas in individualism, it's what's inside that matters. Your beliefs, your attitudes, your personality, etc. So we have different concepts of social behavior. In one case, emphasizing external factors. In the other case, emphasizing internal factors. So the collectivists make external attributions much more, and the social environment is seen as stable, while the person is seen as changeable. So the essence of collectivism is that the person is not that important. It's the situation that matters, and the person changes depending on the situation. Whereas in individualism, the person is so important that it's sort of a stable entity, and it's the situation that's going to change. I mentioned already self-description in terms of roles and groups in collectivism. And in socialization, you have a lot of emphasis on obedience, reliability, following traditions, duties, and conformity. there is a study of the Ash phenomenon which shows that collectivists conform in the Ash situation much more than individualists. So this is an example of the kind of socialization that's important. You emphasize conformity, and then the child becomes an adult who is conforming. There's also a relatively low well-being in collectivism, because your well-being depends on who the other people are and what they think about you. You cannot say, I'm wonderful, which is what the individualist will say, because you're not making your own judgment. It depends on what the other people say. Now, this is a very interesting kind of situation. Ed Diener's son was in India, and he asked an Indian woman, are you happy? And the woman said, I don't know, ask my husband. You see, a very different conception of what it means to be happy. Ask my husband. Then the husband would know, but I don't know. So a very different way of thinking. There is also much concern with saving face and with preserving the harmony of the in-group. And also there are large differences in behavior when you are dealing with an in-group member as opposed to an out-group member. You receive much social support in collectivist cultures if you follow in-group norms, but collectivists tend to have poor skills in entering new groups. They are very good at dealing with their relatives and so forth, these stable groups that they are used to. But when they enter a new group, they're kind of shy. They don't know exactly what to do. It's also easy to mobilize the collectivists to fight outgroups. The ideal in collectivism is to fit in rather than to shine. So you try to be modest and sort of fit into the group. And there's very little social loafing when you're working with in-group members. But if you're working with out-group members, there's as much social loafing as there is in individualism. Recreation occurs in groups, in collectivism, and failure is defined as I haven't tried hard enough. There's something wrong with me, as opposed to failure in the individualist, who usually finds something wrong with the situation, with the difficulty of the task, and so forth. Now, I mentioned mixing vertical, horizontal, and these are some examples. Horizontal collectivism, a good example is the Israeli kibbutz. Vertical collectivist, traditional China or the Indian village would be an example of vertical collectivism. Horizontal individualism you find in Sweden, you find it in Australia. And vertical individualism you find in American corporations, in academia, where you want to shine, you want to be the best. And it's important that you be the best. Now, I talked about collectivism and individualism a good deal, but there are many, many more dimensions of cultural variation. And I like to just go very briefly to just give you an overview of the kinds of dimensions that exist, but I won't mention much about them because, first of all, there isn't much research about them. Now, one dimension is sexual differentiation. You sort of contrast societies in which men and women are more or less equal, as in Scandinavia, as opposed to societies in which men and women are very different in status. In Saudi Arabia, women are not even allowed to drive. So you have a big sexual differentiation. The way people deal with time is quite different. You have societies where there's monochronic time, where you deal with one person at a time, and that's the correct way to behave. And you have societies in which you can talk with several people at the same time, which is very confusing to people who are used to monochronic time. You have the contrast between work time and social time, between doing and enjoying, how you use the time, between clock time and event time. In clock time, you say, well, the time is up. we finish the meeting. In event time, you say, oh, well, we haven't finished the meeting, so we will continue meeting. There are many more dimensions. I just glance at these. I'm not going to talk about them because I want to talk about other things. But here's an interesting kind of contrast, and that has to do with sources of power. Back in 1744, Vico wrote this interesting book called The New Science. And he said that the way societies generate laws depends on the gods, the aristocracy, and the people. And this is a progression that moves from very primitive societies where the gods are important to more elaborate and more recent and more modern societies where the people are important. Now this is very interesting because what is happening in Pakistan right now is they try to impose Sharia law. And Sharia law essentially says, we will do what God wants us to do. Because Sharia is actually reflecting the rules that God has told to people in Islam. So they want now to move from democracy, which is what people want in rules, to the gods. And of course that's a regression from the point of view of Vico. But they don't know about that. And they think that this is much better if they do what God wants rather than what the people want. You have many more contrasts here. I won't talk about these. All of these things do exist, and they have been researched a little bit, but really relatively very little. Another domain which is recent is social axioms. Bond and Leung have developed some dimensions of belief systems across the world. And what they find is that there is such a thing as cynicism and social complexity and the emphasis on reward and religiosity as well as fate control. And then they find relationships between these belief systems and attributes of the culture, such as modern economies are low on cynicism, religiosity, and reward, and fate control, but high on social complexity, and so on. These kinds of relationships are very interesting, but I don't have time. I want to talk about something a little new. Just to touch a little bit on cross-cultural training. Of course, many of the things I just said are relevant when you're trying to train somebody from one culture to behave correctly in another culture. And this can be done in various domains, such as in the cognitive domain, where you explain to the person how do people in that other culture think. And in the case of social axioms, they found that if the person has the similar belief system as the culture to which the person is going, the fit or the adjustment is good. But if the belief systems are different, then the adjustment is not so good. So that's the cognitive domain. Then you want the motivational domain, that the person would like to relate to people from the other culture, would look for ways to relate to people from the other cultures. And finally, you have the behavioral domain, in which the person learns what are the correct behaviors so that adjustment to the other culture is successful. An example would be a professor from a horizontal individualist culture meeting with a student from a vertical collectivist culture. There will be some difficulties. The professor may say, "Call me Harry," and the student will insist on saying Professor Triandis. And, well, what can you do? After 40 years of doing this, you say, well, all right, I'll give up. I'm not going to continue fussing about this. So you can see here certain things that are creating problems, and you can analyze them in terms of these dimensions that I mentioned earlier. So now I want to talk to you about something new, and that's the next frontier. Now, I worked, of course, on culture for 40 years, and then after I retired 12 years ago, I did some work like reviewing papers and things of that sort. But then 9/11 happened. And it really shook me up because I read in the New York Times that the terrorists defined what they did as doing God's work. And I thought, this is very interesting. What kind of a God requires killing 3,000 innocent people? That's very peculiar. Now, I knew that there were strange beliefs around the world. For example, the Aztecs had the belief that if they didn't kill the prisoners that they captured, then the world would come to an end. Well, that's a strange belief. I don't know where they got it. Maybe the priests wanted to have power, and since the priests were doing the killing, they were taking out the heart of the prisoners. Maybe that gave them power. And then in order to justify this, they told people that if we don't do this, the world will come to an end. And the people believed it, and so it happened. As you can see, it's fairly easy to fool people. And this is the focus of the book, is fooling ourselves. We really fool ourselves. And we do this with self-deception in politics, religion, and terrorism in this case. And I'll give you some examples. And I think the new frontier might be to examine cultural differences in self-deception. How frequently do people in different cultures have self-deceptions? But let's see what self-deception is first. Oh, the two P's. Well, that's not supposed to be there, but forget about the second P. A definition of self-deception. One definition. There are many. Actually, psychologists started studying self-deception back in the 1930s. There was a paper by Else Frankel-Brunswick, on self-deception in the 1930s. Remember, she's the one who developed the F scale and fascism and so forth. So she did some work on self-deception. Now, what is self-deception? Well, it's the way we construct the way we see the world. We construct it quite often on the basis of our hopes, needs, and desires. So we use our hopes, needs, and desires to construct the way the world is. And of course, that makes it a very strange kind of examination of the world. But there are many other ways in which we can define self-deception, and I'll give you some examples first, and then I'll mention some other ways. Let me give you some examples, starting with some historical examples, because it's easier to deal with self-deception historically, because we can have a little bit of distance, and we can know what reality is, whereas if we take a contemporary event, we're not so sure what reality is. So self-deception is really a deviation from reality, but what happens there? So let's see what happens in a few of these examples. When the French Revolution started in 1789, with the storming of the Bastille, that day, August the 14th, the King of France, Louis XVI, wrote one word in his diary: rien. Nothing happened. Now, isn't that interesting? The French Revolution started, and he said nothing happened. Of course, had he spent a little more time on this, and had he analyzed the situation a little better, maybe he could have saved his neck from the guillotine, but he didn't. Let me give you another example, which is a little more recent. In 1914, there was the manifesto of 93 German intellectuals. And they said, it is not true that our soldiers invaded or trespassed neutral Belgium. It's not true that our soldiers killed anybody in Belgium. And it's not true that our soldiers burned the library at Louvain, the University of Louvain. Well, all these things were true. But these intellectuals, and they were really the giants of the world at the time intellectually, they didn't know what was going on. All they had was their hopes, needs, and desires. And they signed the manifesto. Now, who were these people? Max Planck, for example, whose work in physics, Nobel Prize, etc., is as important as that of Einstein. Röntgen, who discovered the X-rays. And our own Wilhelm Wundt, who started psychology in 1880. All these people were giants, really intellectually giants. But what did they know? They couldn't know what their soldiers were doing. All they had was hopes, needs, desires. And this is what happens. Our prejudices, our theories, our ways of thinking, our culture influence us so much that we structure the way we see the world, the way these theories and other kinds of belief systems force us to think. Let me give you another example from physics. In France, in the last part of the 19th century, there was a physicist by the name of Blondeau. And he said that he had discovered the N rays. Now, that was a time when the Germans had discovered the X-rays. And of course, that was the end of the 19th century. There was a great deal of competition between France and Germany. So when one of their physicists said he had discovered the N rays, they were delighted. They made him a member of the Académie Française. They tripled his salary, etc., etc. Then there was an American physicist who tried to replicate the studies, and he couldn't do it. So he sent a paper to the best French physics journal, and the journal rejected the paper. Now, this is another attribute of self-deception. You don't like information that doesn't fit your system. If your system says you have the N rays, you don't want somebody to tell you that you don't have the N rays. There are many more examples. One of the people who is very high in self-deception is the president of Iran. The president of Iran said many things, including that there are no homosexuals in Iran. Now, we know from the work of Ford and Beach that there are homosexuals in every culture. Maybe 5%, we don't know exactly what percent, but there are homosexuals in every culture. It's very unlikely that there are no homosexuals in Iran. But it fits his hopes, needs, and desires, so fine, there are no homosexuals in Iran. He also said the Holocaust never took place. He also said that Israel will disappear from the face of the earth, etc., etc. He said many things. And here is the question. What are the determinants of the frequency of these kinds of self-deceptions? Now, one hypothesis is that religiosity has something to do with it. This man must be quite religious. And so it's very likely that the more religious the sample or the individual, the greater the probability that there will be self-deceptions. I also think that vertical collectivism might be related to self-deception, but that needs to be examined further. Now, there's another attribute which is correlated with self-deception that has to do with cognitive simplicity, complexity. Most of the beliefs that are simple and which involve self-deception are relatively simple. Think of the concept of God. It's a very simple idea. Instead of dealing with astrophysics and exobiology and paleontology and evolutionary theory and this and that and the other, too complex, you just say, who created the world? God, period. That's it. Simple. And there are a lot of things that happen this way, where we simplify the world and we can actually analyze context, or we can analyze text by seeing how many dimensions does the person use in discussing phenomena. So if you contrast, for example, George Bush and Obama, you have simplicity, complexity. It's a very strict, very obvious kind of difference. In George Bush, you have concepts such as the axis of evil, where highly heterogeneous things are placed in the same category. You have us versus them, another simple way of looking at the world, as opposed to the more complex ways that Obama uses. Now, I think we can study this by using the human relations area files. And we can analyze these files to see what kinds of complexity and what kind of self-deception we can find in the files. We can also look at the kinds of pronouncements of prominent people, the kinds of people we see on television every day. As I see people on television, I analyze them. And I say, is this a self-deception? Very likely. Very often it is a self-deception. And is it cognitively simple? Oh yes, very likely it is cognitively simple. And the two things go together. It's a fascinating kind of situation. There's a book that discusses the kinds of misstatements that have been made by American politicians and also the American press about the war in Iraq. In this book, I identify 77 self-deceptions. And then I looked at these self-deceptions in terms of what kinds of themes were involved. And there were two themes that were quite prominent. One was that everything will be fine very soon. The other one was God. God is very often associated with self-deceptions. So we can analyze the text. We can see what kinds of material is there. Is there kind of complexity in the analysis? Is there an examination of a variety of points of view? And that would be more complex. And also, how does it fit the self-deception situation? Now, I mentioned self-deception with a certain amount of a derogatory attitude, but I want to correct myself, because a little self-deception is good for us. And this is the problem. This, of course, is a more complex idea, because at the extreme, if you say no self-deception, or if you say a lot of self-deception, then you have things that are relatively simple. But when you say that a little is good for us, then that's a little more complex. Now let me explain this. There is data showing that when there is no self-deception, people become depressed. Too much realism is not good for us. It is better if we have a bit of self-deception. For example, if we believe that our spouse only has positive attributes, that's wonderful. Then we have a good marriage. But if we are too realistic, it's not so good. On the other hand, if we overdo this and we have tremendous self-deceptions, then we really get into trouble. There is this wonderful little book by Milton Keach, who was here at the time he wrote it, The Three Christs of Ypsilanti. He went to the mental hospital in Ypsilanti and he found three people who thought that they were Christ. And so he put them together, said, oh, talk to each other. And here's an example of the kind of conversation that came out. How could he be Christ when I am Christ? He's crazy. That solves the problem. So you see here the problem that we have is the degree of complexity is different. If you have no self-deception, it's a very simple world, but you're depressed. If you have a lot of self-deceptions, it's a bad world also. So you want a little bit of self-deception. And Shelley Taylor has done some very nice work on what she calls positive illusions. If people have positive illusions, they are happier, they are more productive, there are all kinds of positive things that follow from positive illusions. And for example, if they have cancer and they believe that they're going to live forever, wonderful. They live actually 9 months more than if they don't have such a belief. So what you have essentially is a rather complicated argument in which a little bit of self-deception is good for us, but too much is not so good for us. And not any self-deception is also not so very good for us. Oops. What did I do? Oh. Well, I had a finals. Oh. I had one more slide, but it isn't there. Okay. Well, in any case, what I tried to give you is a sort of an overall view of the relationship between these cultural syndromes and some social behaviors. And I hope I conveyed to you that there are a variety of relationships, and that the new frontier might be to examine how self-deceptions, which is, I think, a very interesting phenomenon, are occurring in humans, and what sort of frequency of self-deception do we have. And I think we should be paying attention to that phenomenon, because when we elect people, we should elect people who do not have very many self-deceptions, because we are really in trouble when we have people with lots of self-deceptions. Thank you. Now, I'm ready to answer questions. And who wants to talk or to ask a question? Yeah. Norm.
What do you think is the role? You earlier talked about there are associations between education, level of education, how much education someone has had, and certain sort of cultural views or personalities. Well, what's the role of us? What is our role as educators in terms of nurturing or preventing self-deception?
Mm-hmm. I think that education makes people cognitively more complex and likely to catch their self-deceptions better than low education. I think that the frequency of self-deceptions will be higher among the less educated. This is all theory. I have no data, but observations. And I think that there is some relationship here with the education increasing both complexity and lowering the frequency of self-deceptions. Yes?
I was wondering how you can tell the difference between self-deception and just bold-faced lying. You look at the president of North Korea, who says they shot a satellite up into space and everyone else thinks it crashed into the Pacific Ocean. Is that just a lie, or is that a self-deception as well?
Well, it's very difficult to tell the difference. Think about the presence of weapons of mass destruction. Did the Bush administration lie to us, or did they really believe it? I can't tell. I mean, it's probable that they believed it, but that would be a self-deception. But if they didn't believe it and they intentionally fooled us, that's a different matter. And there are many situations in which the two are really intertwined. Very difficult to tell the difference. One of the arguments in self-deception, which is fascinating, is that men try to convince women that they're going to be steady, that they're going to be a reliable provider, etc. Now, by sort of fooling them and doing that consciously, they are actually deceiving them. But in order to deceive, you do better if you self-deceive. Then you really believe it. And quite often they self-deceive. And of course the women probably, if they believe it, self-deceive. And so it works out fine. Any other questions? Yes?
Thinking of all the greater mobility across societies now, and when you were talking earlier about cultural fit and cultural misfit, what are your thoughts or projections if you look to the future and you think in terms of, all the talk about smaller world, people being more aware of cultural differences or perhaps being trained more and more sensitive, do you see some of those misunderstandings and misfits lessening or being greater?
Well, it would depend who is changing. There are some interesting data, for example, from East Germans moving to West Germany. If they scored high in allocentrism at the time they moved, they did not adjust well. But if they scored high in idiocentrism, then they adjusted very well. So it seems to have to do with the kind of person you are and the kind of environment in which you move. Of course, the environments tend to move towards individualism. And certainly as they become more complex with information societies and so on, they become more individualistic and looser also, and so on. All these things seem to be going together, not very strongly, but they do go together. And so I think that the movement is in that direction. And you see that even in very collectivist cultures, they have to pass new laws that require people to act correctly. A fascinating thing in Singapore is that they had to pass a law that people should take care of their parents. Now, this is fundamental in Chinese culture, that you take care of your parents. But as they became affluent, they went skiing instead of taking care of their parents. In France, they did the same thing. They went on vacation in August of, I think it was 2006, and several people died of the heat because they didn't take care of their parents. So they are neglecting their in-group because they're doing their own thing. I mean, they went swimming, they went skiing, or whatever they did. So in Singapore, of course, they are controlling people a little bit more than we are. They said to people, no, you must take care of your parents. And so, okay, we'll take care of our parents. Filial piety is such an important element in Chinese culture that to not take care of your parents is really scandalous. But some of these rich people did that. Yes?
I don't need the mic. I'm pretty loud. Do you think in terms of leader preference that there's a certain type of person that is usually always preferred as a leader, or? Oh. Okay, in terms of leader preference, do you think that there's a type of leader, a type of person that's usually preferred as a leader in all cultures, or that differs by culture?
Well, I think that there are cultural differences in who is an ideal leader. You have Mizumi's theory, for example, of leadership, which is very different from the theories that we have in the West. He emphasizes the importance of both relating to people and emphasizing production, but almost equally. And you have J.B. Sinha saying that you got to start by being very positive in interpersonal relationships, and only then can you push for productivity. Now, that's a different way of thinking about leadership than the way we think, where we think productivity is important, we'll just do it. Of course, there's this fascinating study by House on leadership across cultures. It has a tremendous amount of data that links different aspects of culture, including collectivism. He has even two kinds of collectivism, and different kinds of output variables in terms of successful in leadership situations. Yeah.
How stable is idiocentrism and allocentrism? Is it easy to change an idiocentric to allocentric, or the other way around?
Well, it's interesting that just simple primes can make a person change. Now, a prime, of course, doesn't last very long, but you take these people from Hong Kong who have been exposed to both the West and the East, and you give them a Chinese prime, and they are very collectivist, and then you give them the same people. You give them a Western prime, and they become individualists for a little bit. So apparently it's not a very strong thing. I have the suspicion that we all have both the allocentric system and the idiocentric system in our cognitive systems, and we use them depending on the situation. If the situation calls for the use of the allocentric system, we're going to use it. If it does not, then we use the other one. So I think we're not really that stable. It depends on the situation. And I think the situation is terribly powerful. It really modifies us. And I don't think we have been paying enough attention to the situation. Any other questions? Yeah, over there.
Do you think that a culture as a whole can engage in the same kind of self-deception as happens at the individual level? And if so, what kind of implications does that have?
I didn't quite get it because I think it's a little, you need to speak up a little more.
Okay. Do you think that a culture as a whole can engage in the same kind of self-deception that happens at the individual level? And if so, what kind of implications does that have for the culture as a whole?
Well, actually in the book I discuss different kinds of self-deception at the individual, at the cultural level as well. And of course, I take a very dim view of religion, and I have a whole chapter on religion. It's actually the largest chapter. And I take the view that religion is a system of self-deception, and I make a distinction between two kinds of religions. External religions, where you have supernaturals of various kinds up in heaven, which are, as far as I'm concerned, superstitions. And then you have internal religions, where the emphasis is on what happens inside you. And there are many cultures that have this part as well, the inside you. Even the jihadists have this kind of idea of controlling yourself as opposed to what you do to the outside. Now, Buddhism is a good example of an internal religion, the original Buddhism, not the way it evolved. What happens with most religions is that as they evolve, they go from mouth to mouth to mouth, and they change. And they pick up all of the prejudices of the people that they are, that transmit the information. So the original of most religions is very different from the way it ends up. And this is a very interesting phenomenon. Of course, Bartlett studied the phenomenon by presenting one of the stories of the American Indians and asking people to tell the story, and then the next person told the story again after hearing it from the previous person, and so on, until you got a very different story, usually a story which was simple and sharp, and had all the prejudices of the people who transmitted the stories. Prejudice is very much involved in the way these kinds of religions are evolving from the origin to the way it comes at the end. So it's a very interesting phenomenon that we change the way we perceive the world as a result of our theory and our prejudice and our belief systems and so forth. And our culture influences that tremendously. So it reshapes a lot of these things. I guess, are we towards the end?
No more questions?
Huh?
Let me take a moment to give Harry a small token of appreciation from the Center for sharing his presentation
Thank
with
you.
us. And let's thank Harry Triandis again.
Thank you. Oh. Thank you very much.